Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Well, it's definitely never my intention to get too political on this channel. I think it is important for me to offer, um, a Catholic perspective on how the faith ought to inform our conscience, specifically when it comes to voting, and especially when it comes to the upcoming election between Trump and Kamala Harris in the United States. Because, there's a lot of liberal Catholics, I think, that are spreading misinformation about this, as is usually the case, and we'll get into that later. But before we get into this topic, though, remember to hit the like button to get a notification whenever I go live or upload a video. And also comment, let me know what you think. I'd love to hear your thoughts. It also does help the algorithm too, so that's also a plus. And finally, if you want to support what I do, consider becoming a member of the channel or mainly a patron, patreon.com/classicaltheist. Great way to support what I do. It really helps me to keep making more content. You get a lot of things, monthly book recommendations, monthly articles. You get Q&A access through your private messaging. That's unlimited. Um, Also, a video request if you want me to cover a topic, if you want me to react to content, do a stream. That's also in it for you as well. And also some periodic exclusive streams. Right now, I'm currently working on starting up again the St. Thomas Aquinas commentary on the Psalms. So the next installment of that's going to be released this week. Lots of ways to that, lots of things you get, but it also helps support what I do. So if you want to support me, patreon.com/classicaltheist, great way to do it. Now, onto the topic. Just to prove my impartiality here, I'll say up front that on a personal level, um, I'm a bit more apathetic and indifferent about the outcome of this election as opposed to elections prior. Many of you know that I do lean very heavily conservative, right wing on most issues, and while I have voted for Trump in the past, I've like many others kind of lost a little bit of faith in his ability to carry the torch on the issues that I really care about. I do think that ever since 2016 he's lost a bit of his edge and has kind of compromised on all kinds of issues, whether it's about restricting illegal immigration or keeping us out of unnecessary foreign entanglements, the whole nine yards. And so as for my personal view, I do support, and I'll talk about this a little later, the ongoing campaign to threaten to withhold the vote, so that he can course correct and restore that original vision, reignite that fire. So what I'm going to say in this video, therefore, is going to be very objective, from a strictly Catholic perspective, regardless of what my personal feelings are or where I happen to lean on matters of political prudence about which Catholics are free to disagree. Well, before we get into Trump versus Kamala in particular, let's start off here by discussing what the church, or what an informed Catholic theological perspective might have to say about voting as such within the context of a largely democratic society. This is a democratic republic, but any society that is informed by significant democratic elements. So, so let's get into that. Um, While the popes have taken great care, and I want to be clear about this, the popes have taken great care in insisting upon the per se legitimacy of democratically structured political systems, it has to be maintained, I think, and I'll touch on this a little bit here, that if a society were to most closely mirror the divinely imbued order of creation, then at least some form of monarchy should be conceded as the most ideal, at least in the abstract. And, I'll let St. Thomas Aquinas make this argument for me. So St. Thomas says in his De Regno, he says, this question may be considered first from the viewpoint of the purpose of government. The aim of any ruler should be directed toward securing the welfare of that which he undertakes to rule. The duty of the pilot, for instance, is to preserve his ship amidst the perils of the sea and to bring it unharmed to the port of safety. Now, the welfare and safety of a multitude formed into a society lies in the preservation of its unity. It's a metaphysical point there, which is called peace. If this is removed, the benefit of social life is lost, and moreover, the multitude in its disagreement becomes a burden to itself. The chief concern of the ruler of a multitude, therefore, is to procure the unity of peace. It is not even legitimate for him to deliberate whether he shall establish peace in a multitude subject to him, just as a physician does not deliberate whether he shall heal the sick man in charge to him. For no one should deliberate about an end which he is obliged to seek, but only about the means to attain this end. Wherefore the apostle, having commended the unity of the faithful people, says, Be ye careful to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Thus, the more efficacious a government is in keeping this unity of peace, the more useful it will be. For we call that more useful which leads more directly to the end. Now it is manifest that what is itself one can more efficaciously bring about unity than several, just as the most efficacious cause of heat is that which is by its nature hot. Therefore, the rule of one man is more useful than the rule of many. So that's St. Thomas's just general argument for like the metaphysical ontological superiority of monarchy. I think there's a lot of other reasons for it too, and I think a lot of the reasons against it fail. But that's not really what this video is about. But I did want to just kind of articulate what my position is from the standpoint of like political theory. Um, but while from a theological and a philosophical point of view, given what we've just said, monarchy is clearly the more fitting form of government, which most clearly mirrors the divine order of things. Again, as I said, the Catholic Church has also taught explicitly that this intrinsic superiority, it doesn't preclude, it doesn't take away the intrinsic legitimacy of other forms of government, such as, for example, in this case, democratic republics. And Pope Leo XIII actually teaches this rather emphatically in his encyclical Immortale Dei, and that encyclical is considered by many traditional Catholics to be the most important papal writing advancing the cause of integralism, maybe second to Quanta Cura, but it is a landmark encyclical. Now he says, quote, um, this then is the teaching of the Catholic Church considering the constitution and government of the state. By the words and decrees just cited, if judged dispassionately, no one of the several forms of government is in itself condemned, inasmuch as none of them contains anything contrary to Catholic doctrine, and all of them are capable, if wisely and justly managed, to ensure the welfare of the state. Neither is it blameworthy in itself, in any manner, for the people to have a share, greater or less, in the government. For at certain times and under certain laws, such participation may not only be of benefit to citizens, but may even be of obligation. Nor is there any reason why one should accuse the Church of being wanting in gentleness of action or largeness of view, or of being opposed to real or lawful liberty. The Church indeed deems it unlawful to place the various forms of divine worship on the same footing as the true religion, but does not, on account, condemn those rulers who, for the sake of securing some great good, or of hindering some great evil, allow patiently custom or usage to be a kind of sanction for each kind of religion having its place in the state. It's a crucial distinction there. And in fact, the Church is wont to take earnest heed that no one shall be forced to embrace the Catholic faith against his will, for, as St. Augustine wisely reminds us, man cannot believe otherwise than of his own will. And so that is Pope Leo XIII on the issue. And so, given this per se legitimacy of broadly democratic forms of government, we then have to turn to what the Church teaches about the hallmark of democratic governance, namely its electoral component, voting. Thus, the central theme of this video is what the Church teaches about the morality of voting and how these principles might apply to the current 2024 presidential election. Now, first things first, we have to absolutely avoid the trap here of conflating And a lot of liberal Catholics tend to do this, conflating the legitimacy of democratic governance with a pragmatic view of the truth or with a relativist conception of ethics. A lot of liberal Catholics tend to do that, and they hide it under the term of, of the priority and or sovereignty of conscience. But the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith has a different view. It's been clear on this very point, and the CDF under Ratzinger said, quote, if Christians must recognize the legitimacy of differing points of view about the organization of worldly affairs, they are also called to reject as injurious to democratic life a conception of pluralism that reflects moral relativism. Democracy must be based on the true and solid foundation of non-negotiable ethical principles, which are the underpinning of life in society, unquote. So I think this is really the basis that Catholic institutions draw from in order to draw this famous distinction between negotiable and non negotiable issues. Now, this distinction between negotiable and non negotiable issues, I mean, a lot of people misunderstand it. A lot of people think it doesn't come from the church, but I've just read that it does. But this distinction is rooted in the basic Catholic moral principle, so it's rooted in moral theology, that it is never legitimate to formally cooperate with a policy or a moral action that is taken, uh, which by its very nature is opposed to the moral order of the universe imbued in it by God. So, take, for example, the issues of abortion and the issue of immigration. With abortion, the church teaches unequivocally and infallibly that to procure a direct abortion, it's not just incidentally wrong in most cases, rather, it is by its very nature opposed to the good. It violates the natural moral law of itself. It is an intrinsically evil act and can admit of no moral exceptions whatsoever. So that's the issue of abortion. Now, on the issue of immigration, there is, of course, a potential for good and evil in the administration of whatever immigration policy, but while the church provides us with a broad set of principles with which to deal with immigration policy, there is a spectrum of allowable applications of those principles in the prudential order. Strictly speaking, for example, it is not intrinsically evil to refuse entry into a host country of and by itself, nor is it intrinsically evil to deport a migrant who is residing in a host country illegally. These are acts that may be moral, they may be immoral, depending on the context. And for this reason, Catholics of goodwill can disagree about how best to apply those broad principles to this or that concrete situation. That's the nature of prudence. And so, this, therefore, is why abortion is considered a non negotiable issue and why immigration policy is not. And even on the immigration issue, by the way, I mean, I think that while there is certainly more wiggle room for a Catholic, we should also understand that the magisterium of the church does withhold, or does uphold rather, the values of demographic preservation, secure borders, ensuring that a country's immigration policy doesn't undermine its sovereignty or public wealth. All of these things, regardless of what you believe about it, they have been taught in the Catechism. They've been taught in Pius XII's Exsul Familia. They've been taught in Pius XII's Summi Pontificatus. So long as like all races are treated with dignity and respect, so long as um, the basic human dignity of the migrant is upheld. But these factors are to be given due consideration according to the popes. It's also in Pius XI's Mit Benedendor. So, so that's on immigration. But to bring us back to the central topic at hand, is how is it that we can apply these Catholic moral principles about democratic participation, specifically from the CDF? How can we apply that to this election? And now, first things first, we want to point out that this election is notably different, at least from a Catholic perspective. And it's uniquely different even from 4 years ago. Um, And that's because for the first time in a very long time, both major parties are running on what is essentially a pro choice platform when it comes to abortion. Since overturning Roe v. Wade, public opinion on abortion in the United States tragically has been undergoing a massive shift in its favor to the point where it's basically become politically untenable for a politician to run on a pro life or even vaguely anti abortion platform. It's for this reason that Trump himself, Donald Trump, has now refused to sign any legislation that would even attempt to restrict abortion on the federal level. That being said, it's not to say that Trump has made the Republican Party pro abortion in the same way that the Democratic Party is pro abortion. Trump is not, for example, running on the promise to make abortion more accessible, and nor is he running on a platform to actively prevent abortion from being restricted on a state by state level. So it's more of a hands off approach. So when you have one side that is actively running on making abortion more accessible, and the other side is simply not doing that, you could, I think, apply the following principle of John Paul II to this situation. So John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae says the following quote: "A particular problem of conscience can arise in cases where a legislative vote would be decisive for the passage of a more restrictive law, aimed at limiting the number of authorized abortions, in place of a more permissive law already passed or ready to be voted on. Such cases are not infrequent. It is a fact that while in some parts of the world there continue to be campaigns to introduce laws favoring abortion, often supported by powerful international organizations, in other nations, particularly those which have already experienced the bitter fruits of such permissive legislation, there are growing signs of a rethinking in this matter. In a case like the one just mentioned, when it is not possible to overturn or completely abrogate pro abortion law, an elected official whose absolute personal opposition to procured abortion was well known could illicitly support proposals aimed at limiting the harm done by such a law and at lessening its negative consequences at the level of general opinion and public morality. This does not, in fact, represent an illicit cooperation with an unjust law, but rather a legitimate and proper attempt to limit its evil aspects." And so clearly, when you have, Trump simply not actively supporting the greater accessibility of abortion and not getting in the way of certain restrictions, whereas you have Kamala Harris, who is definitely in support of making abortion as widely accessible as it possibly can be, and getting in the way, blocking any possible restrictions. I think you can apply John Paul II's principle, and so on this issue, I think it can safely be said that a Catholic could either vote for Trump or not vote at all, but would not be allowed to vote for either RFK Jr., because he also has a very pro-abortion platform, or Kamala Harris. So that's the abortion issue. And it's just very important to point that out, because this passage of Evangelium Vitae gets ignored by liberal Catholics who think that, oh, well, they're both not perfect on abortion, so I can just ignore the issue electorally. No, no, you can't do that. This is specifically having to do with a lawmaker, but the same principle applies to a voter, right? Okay. So let's move on to the issue of, traditional marriage and gender ideology. And this is another issue where there's been a noticeable change on the Republican side. In fact, Donald Trump himself has personally intervened to remove any mention of a traditional, or in reality natural, definition of marriage from the Republican Party platform. This has been an unfortunate development in the Republican Party that's been going on really since the loss of Mitt Romney in 2012, where, at least on social issues, there's been a concerted effort to make the Republican Party more and more libertarian when it comes to sexual morality. And while the recent pushback against gender ideology in the GOP has kind of balanced this out a little bit, it hasn't led to any kind of reversion back to the full throated embrace of marriage as between one man and one woman. So, at least on the issue of homosexuality and gay marriage, there's virtually zero difference between Trump and Harris. There is, however, as I mentioned, a difference on the issue of gender ideology, and I would expect this difference to polarize more and more and more as time goes on. Well, the culture uh, was, and when it comes to sexual morality, while the culture on sexual morality seems to have been um, lost on us for now, there doesn't seem to really be any going back to a Catholic view on sexual morality in the American public. It does seem that this gender ideology backlash has shown that on the transgender issue, um, actually the left is losing the culture war on some level. And so, at least on this issue of gender ideology, I think from a Catholic perspective, Trump would still have to be favored over Harris. And so, once again, when it comes to marriage and gender ideology in the family, I think as a Catholic, you could either not vote or vote for Trump, but you cannot vote for Harris or RFK. Because there's a concerted effort to push for gender ideology in a way that is being somewhat resisted by um, Trump and to a lesser extent even on just the broader Republican side. Um, okay, so while this next issue I'm going to mention hasn't exactly been as explicitly categorized as a non-negotiable, I think that's only because back in the day it hadn't really come up as all too pressing, when in reality I think it's actually one of the most decisive Catholic issues of our time. And that would be this whole issue of religious liberty. So obviously, a Catholic is not to believe in religious liberty as a matter of natural right, because error has no right, has been taught by previous popes. But there is a kind of religious liberty that every Catholic should be promoting and supporting. And that would be the liberty and exaltation, in this case specifically the liberty, of the Catholic Church herself. In other words, not so much keeping the state separate from the church, but protecting the rights and liberties of the church from a secular state. So, when this issue is on the ballot, I think Catholics, out of love for um, the church and out of love for the Great Commission, would absolutely be obliged to see this issue as a non negotiable, such that if there is a major candidate running for president who poses a real and substantial threat to the independence and liberty of the Catholic Church, or poses a threat to the exercise of her divine mission in a given nation, then a Catholic is absolutely going to be obligated to not vote for such a candidate. And seeing as Kamala Harris would actively seek to prevent Catholic institutions from freely adhering to Catholic teachings on contraception and sexual morality and gender ideology, she said as much, that in itself would absolutely be a disqualification. And now, Trump, by not posing these kinds of threats in a negative way, by default, would be then the only acceptable candidate to vote for. Now, again, as I've said before, that's not to say that a Catholic is obligated to vote for Trump. It's just that a Catholic is obligated to refrain from voting for the other major candidates. Now, on the war and peace front, it gets a little bit complicated, because on the one hand, war does absolutely involve within it a very real possibility of intrinsically evil acts being a part of one's foreign policy. On the other hand, matters of war and peace, while they are to be governed by unwavering moral principles, can on some level be considered a matter of prudence because war conducted just in and of itself can be just. And determining whether a concrete case measures up to the criteria of just war, well, that requires a lot of prudential judgment here. A lot of prudence goes into that, and much of it is left to the discretion of individual conscience. Now, needless to say, and even the Pope has been outspoken about this, I think a Catholic cannot in good conscience support the ongoing, genocide and war crimes that are happening in Gaza right now. But as of right now, there's no clear evidence that either Kamala or Trump could be considered in good standing with the church when it comes to opposing Netanyahu's war crimes. And while it's true that Trump could be considered more supportive than Kamala of Israel, his overall foreign policy suggests that um, he may be just as, if not more, interested than Kamala in putting an end to the conflict and advocating for a permanent ceasefire in the region. Kamala may belong to a party that is increasingly adversarial to Israeli interests, but she's still an avid supporter of the Israeli state, and there's no evidence that she would push back substantially against these war crimes. And this is not even to mention the fact that Pope Pius X has officially stood opposed Israel on theological grounds. And so on this issue, while I think that Trump's overall non-interventionist approach to foreign policy is more in line with Catholic teaching on war and peace, when it comes to the current humanitarian crisis happening, I don't think either candidate really exemplifies an acceptable Catholic position on the issue. And so one's decision would then have to be rooted in a broader cost benefit analysis when discerning the lesser of two evils. And I think, given what has been said, Trump still would remain the favorite in such an analysis. So, in conclusion, I think I've covered the core issues here. Um, I want to say a few things. Well, I think it's pretty clear and manifest from what we've gone over that if you're going to go by the non-negotiable issues, it is demonstrably illicit, wrong, immoral, sinful to cast a vote for Kamala Harris. Whereas it is licit, allowable, permissible, not sinful to either not vote at all or to vote for Donald Trump. Now, as many of you are aware, as I've alluded to in the beginning, there is an ongoing campaign right now to withhold support for Trump as a way to protest how he's running his campaign, since it's pretty clear that ever since he staffed his administration, his first administration, it's kind of been a continuous downward spiral away from his original, anti-globalist America First revolutionary movement from 2016 toward a more conventional, standard GOP political project, but without the social conservatism. Um, so, for this reason, many rightly fear that the Trump movement will just become partially or even primarily responsible for defanging the right wing political infrastructure in America and make it about as conservative as what the Tory party has become in the United Kingdom. And as a result of this fear, there's been this ongoing campaign to withhold the vote if he doesn't course correct and restore that original vision that he ran and won on in 2016. And I'm very sympathetic and supportive of this campaign. Um, so while I intended for this video to give an informative assessment of how the Catholic faith should inform political prudence with regard to this election, um, this is not to be construed as an actual political endorsement of Donald Trump. It's just to say that the Catholic Church still, despite the political persuasions of the current Pope, has no room whatsoever for electorally supporting left wing political movements, especially when they embrace these non negotiable intrinsic moral evils. And any Catholic that attempts to gaslight you into thinking that these non negotiables are arbitrary or that you can just ignore abortion or religious liberty and gender ideology in favor of merely prudential considerations having to do with like immigration or economic policy, any Catholic gaslighting you into that has no leg to stand on. And I think I've demonstrated as much. And so the church rejects that framing, and I think you should too. So thank you so much for watching, and if you like this video, give it a like, give it a thumbs up. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want to support the work I do, patreon.com/classicaltheist, a great way to do that. Hit the bell to get a notification when I go live and upload a video, and I'll see you soon. God bless.